My adoptive mother called it a special dinner. We were waiting for the main course to be cleared when she slid a thick stack of stapled legal documents across the white linen tablecloth. She looked right at me. Her voice cold and steady, and said I was adopted and they were done. She took a slow sip of her wine and added that I was never really theirs and never would be. They had only kept me this long for the financial optics. My sister Lauren smirked from across the table. I did not cry. I looked down at the severance waiver, then back up at the woman who raised me. And I smiled. I told her I knew. I said I had known for 8 months. And that is why I asked someone to join us tonight. The heavy oak door of the private dining room clicked open behind them. And nobody at that table moved. Welcome to Revenge Order. The place where toxic families push too far and find out exactly what happens when the silent daughter finally speaks up. How old were you when you realized your family treated you like a transaction instead of a person? Let me know your age in the comments and hit subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, let us get into the details. I am 27 years old. I live in Wilmington, Delaware, and I work as a corporate risk actuary. My entire career is built on analyzing probability, assessing liabilities, and predicting exactly when a bad investment will collapse. My adoptive parents did not understand what I did for a living. They just thought I was quiet. They mistook my silence for weakness. The restaurant Victoria chose was called the Vanguard. It was the kind of place with velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and waiters who replaced your napkin the second you stood up. Victoria only booked private rooms here when she needed a controlled environment to exercise her power. I arrived 10 minutes early. But they were already seated. The geography of the table told me everything I needed to know about the evening. Richard, my adoptive father and CEO of Harrison Logistics, sat at the head. Lauren sat directly to his right. Her chair was pulled so close to his that their elbows nearly brushed. My chair was positioned at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I sat down and placed my plain manila folder next to my water glass. Victoria eyed the folder for a fraction of a second before dismissing it. She smoothed the front of her designer dress. Her face an unreadable mask. The air in the room felt heavy, carrying the atmospheric drop that hits right before a thunderstorm. Lauren ordered a vintage Bordeaux without checking the price. She spent the first 20 minutes of the dinner complaining about the junior staff at the shipping firm. Lauren held the title of Senior Vice President of Compliance. She spent her days online shopping while I secretly built the compliance frameworks her father begged me to handle off the books. She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto mine, and asked if my little math job was paying the rent on my apartment. I kept my eyes on my plate. I sliced my steak, noting the precise resistance of the knife against the meat. I told her the math job paid exactly what it was worth. Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He refused to look in my direction. He just stared at the ice melting in his scotch glass. His knuckles were pale from gripping the crystal too tightly. He was a man who hid behind board meetings and expensive liquor to avoid the uncomfortable reality of his own household. The waiter stepped into the room to clear the plates. Victoria waved him off with a sharp flick of her wrist and told him to close the door and ensure we were not disturbed. The heavy brass latch clicked into place. The sound echoed off the wood paneled walls, sealing us in. Victoria folded her hands on the table. She wore a diamond ring that caught the low light, sending sharp little fractures of brightness across my face. She breathed in deeply. She was preparing to deliver the line she had practiced in the mirror all week. I rested my hands in my lap. My pulse held steady at 60 beats per minute. The silence stretched between us. Victoria liked to let the quiet do her heavy lifting. She sat with her spine rigid against the leather chair, letting the expensive air of the private dining room press down on me. She believed that if she made the silence uncomfortable enough, I would break first. I would ask what was wrong. I would lean forward and seek her approval. begging for the scrap of affection she always kept just out of reach. But as an actuary, I understand the value of a void. Silence is just an empty column on a spreadsheet waiting for a data entry. I was in no rush to feel it. Watching her sit there calculating the exact moment to strike, I felt a familiar coldness settle over my skin. It was the same clinical detachment she had modeled for me my entire life. Her cruelty was never the loud, chaotic kind. There were no thrown plates or screaming matches in our household. Her abuse was strictly administrative. She managed my childhood the way a ruthless corporate liquidator manages a failing asset. The clearest example of her methodology occurred the year Lauren and I turned 16. Lauren is 8 months older than me, a biological timeline detail Victoria loved to emphasize. On the morning of Lauren's 16th birthday, Richard led us all out to the circular gravel driveway of our estate. Parked near the fountain was a brand new luxury sedan. It was pearl white with a red velvet bow draped across the hood. Lauren shrieked, hugged our father, and spent the next hour sitting in the driver's seat, inhaling the scent of fresh factory leather. Victoria stood on the porch, smiling softly, her hand resting on Richard's arm. They looked like a magazine advertisement for the perfect American family. 8 months later, my 16th birthday arrived on a rainy Tuesday. There was no walk to the driveway. There was no cake waiting on the marble kitchen island. Instead, when I came down for breakfast, Victoria was seated at the dining table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. She gestured for me to sit opposite her. She did not wish me a happy birthday. She simply spun the legal pad around so it faced me. Written in her sharp, slanted handwriting was a list. It was an itemized ledger of my existence. She had tallied the cost of my public high school math to Catholic registration. She had listed the price of the winter coat I needed the previous month. She factored in the estimated cost of my daily packed lunches, the electricity used in my bedroom, and the routine dental cleaning from my last checkup. At the bottom of the page, underlined twice in red ink, was a final dollar amount. She tapped the red number with her manicured fingernail. She looked me in the eye and stated that I was an underperforming line item in her social portfolio. She told me that while Lauren represented the future of the Rodriguez legacy, I represented an ongoing, unrecoverable expense. She suggested I get a part-time job to offset the burden I placed on her generosity. I stared at the red ink until the numbers blurred. I learned that day that love was not a right. It was a budget and I was bankrupting it. Richard allowed all of this to happen. He was the chief executive officer of Harrison Logistics, commanding thousands of employees and managing complex international supply chains. Yet inside the walls of his own home, he was a hollow suit. He enabled the divide. He bought his domestic peace by sacrificing my dignity. He allowed Victoria to elevate Lauren as the blood while I was managed like a charity case they regretted taking in. Sitting across from him now at the vanguard, watching him hide behind his Scotch glass, I felt nothing but a quiet analytical pity. He was a man who traded his conscience for quiet evenings. There was only one variable in Victoria's meticulous accounting that she failed to control. His name was Harrison Rodriguez, my adoptive grandfather before he passed away when I was 12. Grandfather Harrison was the only person in that sprawling cold estate who treated me as a human being rather than an obligation. He was a man carved from old-world grit. The founder who built the shipping empire from a single cargo truck into a coastal monopoly. He smelled distinctly of sharp peppermint and expensive cigars. While Victoria hosted charity galas to parade her wealth, Harrison preferred to sit in his dark mahogany study, reviewing manifests and smoking. I was the one who saw the isolation Victoria subjected me to. He saw how she pushed my chair to the far edge of the dinner table, and he decided to weaponize my quiet nature. Harrison taught me how to read contracts before I was old enough to apply for a driver license. I would sit on the thick Persian rug in his study, while he handed me redacted shipping leases and vendor agreements. He taught me to ignore the bold print at the top of the page, the hollow promises, and corporate jargon. He pointed a thick calloused finger at the tiny paragraphs buried at the bottom. He told me the truth always hides in the fine print willow. He said, "People will lie to your face with a smile, but the paper will always tell you exactly what they intend to steal from you." When his heart began to fail, he called me into his study one last time. He knew his son was weak. He saw right through Victoria's shallow narcissism. He knew exactly what they would eventually try to do to me once he was gone. And his protective shadow faded. He did not offer me empty reassurances. Instead, he opened the top drawer of his heavy oak desk and handed me a heavy solid silver fountain pen. His initials were monogrammed into the metal clip. He told me to keep it hidden, to never let Victoria see it, and to only use it when I needed to rewrite the rules of a rigged game. That silver pen was sitting at the bottom of my leather tote bag, resting by my feet under the table at the Vanguard. It was a loaded weapon hidden in plain sight. Victoria despised that pen. She had searched the house for it after his funeral, claiming it belonged in a display case. Furious that the old man had entrusted a piece of the family legacy to the adopted stray, she never found it. I kept it close to me, a constant reminder that I was not the victim she wanted me to be. I was the contingency plan. Grandfather Harrison made sure that when Victoria and Richard finally set their trap, the jaws would snap shut entirely on them. He encoded a silent alarm into the foundation of their wealth, and I was the only one who knew how to trigger it. Back in the private dining room, Victoria finally ran out of patience. The void of silence had not broken me. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white linen, her diamond ring clicking softly against the table. She cleared her throat, adopting the practiced, mournful tone of a corporate human resources manager delivering a termination notice. She told me that she and Richard had provided me with a roof, a top-tier education, and a surname that carried immense weight in the state of Delaware. She said they had been more than generous with their resources. The presentation had officially begun. She was laying the groundwork, establishing the narrative of the benevolent saviors burdened by the ungrateful dependent. I let her speak. I kept my breathing slow and measured. I knew the words she was saying were irrelevant. The real story was not happening in the airspace above the table. The real story began 8 months ago on a rainy afternoon in the corporate archives when I found the anomaly that proved my entire life was a breach of contract. Victoria kept talking. Her words floated across the white tablecloth, a carefully rehearsed monologue about gratitude and duty. But the sound faded into the background hum of the restaurant. I did not need to listen to her perform. I already knew the script. I knew the exact foundation of lies her speech was built upon because the path leading to this private dining room had actually started 8 months earlier. It was a rainy Tuesday in late October. I was sitting in the basement archives of the Harrison Logistics corporate headquarters. The room smelled of ozone from the overworked servers and the distinct dry scent of aging paper. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a steady, irritating rhythm. I was down there because my adoptive father, Richard, relied entirely on my silent, uncredited competence to keep his shipping empire compliant with state and federal regulations. Earlier that morning, Lauren had forwarded me an urgent email from the State Regulatory Board. Her attached message was brief, demanding that I reconcile the third quarter logistics matrix before lunch so she could present it to the executive team. That was our established dynamic. I performed the grueling complex mathematical labor in the shadows. I balanced the accounts, cross-referenced the supply chain regulations, and drafted the executive summaries. When the work was perfect, I handed the binder to Lauren. She would sign her name on the cover page, walk into the glass-walled boardroom, and accept the applause. I never complained. The arrangement provided me with unrestricted, unmonitored access to every single ledger the company generated. An actuary thrives on data, and I possess the keys to the entire corporate kingdom. While running a routine audit on a secondary portfolio that Tuesday, my eyes caught a discrepancy. It was a structural anomaly within a specific subsidiary trust. Most accountants would have missed it. The routing numbers were layered under dense corporate jargon designed to look like a standard depreciating asset column. But numbers possess a rhythm. A specific logic that dictates how they should flow. This column disrupted the rhythm. The funds were cycling through a ghost entity and looping back into an offshore holding company without generating the corresponding tax liabilities. I paused my keystrokes. I leaned closer to the monitor. I traced the routing sequence backward, peeling away the digital layers of the shell companies. The trail vanished at the digital firewall, requiring physical documentation to proceed. The digital footprint ended. But the paper trail was registered with the state of Delaware. I left the corporate building and drove through the driving rain to the county records office. It was a brutalist concrete structure downtown filled with exhausted clerks and towering rows of grey filing cabinets. I submitted my corporate identification and requested the foundational charter for the flagged holding company. The clerk returned 20 minutes later and slid a faded heavy dossier across the scratched laminate counter. I took the file to a quiet wooden table in the corner of the reading room. I opened the cover. The first few pages were standard articles of incorporation. But as I turned to the fourth page, my breath hitched in my chest. Printed near the bottom of a sealed tax declaration was a familiar sequence of 9 digits. It was my own social security number. I traced the numbers with my index finger, feeling the raised ink on the page. My heart beat faster. But my mind shifted into a cold clinical overdrive. There was zero logical reason for my personal identification to be tethered to a corporate holding shell established 2 decades ago. I flipped to the next section of the dossier, tearing through the legal jargon until I reached a thick locked subfolder marked as a sealed family court petition. Because the file was registered under my own legal identity, the clerk had not redacted the contents. I opened the clasp. Inside lay my original adoption decree. For 27 years, Victoria had curated a very specific narrative regarding my origin. She claimed I was a helpless orphan, abandoned at a local hospital on a freezing December night. She told everyone in her social circle that she and Richard had visited the ward, seen my fragile face, and felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of philanthropic love. It was a beautiful cinematic fairy tale designed to frame Victoria as a selfless savior. She repeated the story at charity galas and dinner parties, soaking in the admiration of her peers. The paperwork resting on the wooden table revealed a stark, sterile reality. I was not abandoned at a hospital. I was a strategic acquisition. The documents detailed a ruthless, highly orchestrated transaction executed through a predatory private adoption agency. The agency specialized in matching desperate, vulnerable young mothers with wealthy clients seeking expedited arrangements. Attached to the decree were copies of the cleared checks. The Rodriguez estate had funded the agency with staggering, exorbitant donations to bypass the standard waiting periods and background evaluations. Victoria did not rescue me. She purchased me. The emotional impact of the lie was profound. But the actuary inside me pushed the herd aside. People do not spend that kind of money on a whim. There is always a return on investment. I turned the adoption decree over, searching for the underlying motive. That is when I found the breadcrumb that changed the trajectory of my entire life. Stapled to the back of the decree was a highly classified addendum. The paper was thicker, a premium parchment that felt heavy in my hands. Pressed into the bottom corner of the page was a deep red wax seal stamped with the unmistakable crest of Grandfather Harrison's personal estate attorney. My instincts flared, sending a rush of adrenaline through my veins. Grandfather Harrison was a man who calculated every single move he made. He did not waste ink. And he certainly did not involve his elite estate attorney in a simple family court proceeding unless corporate assets were on the line. I read the addendum line by line. The legal phrasing was dense, but the core arithmetic was clear. The document forged an undeniable legal bridge between the multimillion-dollar corporate trust and the specific date my adoption was finalized. The dates matched perfectly. The timeline was not a coincidence. The adoption was not a personal choice driven by a sudden desire to expand the family. It was a condition precedent. It was a mandatory requirement executed to unlock a specific financial vault. Sitting in that quiet, dusty records room, the facade of my childhood shattered. The itemized ledgers Victoria had used to demean me. The isolation at the dinner table. The constant reminders that I was an underperforming asset. It all made perfect, terrifying sense. I was not a daughter. I was a living, breathing loophole. I did not cry. Crying is an emotional response to a loss. And I had just realized I possessed a hidden staggering value. If my existence was the key that unlocked Richard's empire, then my removal from the family tree would undoubtedly trigger a catastrophic structural collapse. I closed the dossier. I slid it back across the laminate counter to the clerk, my face a mask of polite indifference. I walked out of the concrete building and stepped back into the pouring rain. I did not return to the logistics headquarters. Instead, I drove back to my apartment, opened my personal laptop, and began quietly pulling every piece of public record tied to the Harrison estate. I cross-referenced decades of asset transfers, voting share allocations, and inheritance tax filings. I was no longer just the quiet girl auditing shipping manifests. I was preparing for the financial storm of the decade. I was building a defense so airtight, so mathematically flawless that when Victoria finally decided to cut me out, she would bankrupt herself in the process. That rainy afternoon led directly to the leather chair I now occupied at the Vanguard. Victoria finished her opening monologue. She took a slow sip of her wine, expecting me to crumble under the weight of her rejection. She wanted a performance of grief. She wanted me to beg for the scraps she was taking away. She had no idea that the silent girl sitting across from her had already read the fine print. The conflict was no longer emotional. It was empirical. And the next piece of the puzzle I had uncovered in those records was going to ensure that Richard never sat at the head of a boardroom ever again. Victoria sat back in her leather chair at the Vanguard, a serene expression resting on her face. She had just laid her trap on the white linen. The $50,000 severance waiver waited near my water glass. She expected me to reach for the cheap plastic pen she had provided. She anticipated tears. Perhaps a quiet plea for an explanation, followed by my inevitable defeated signature. In her mind, she was purchasing a permanent solution to a 27-year annoyance to understand the true nature of the document. She slid across the table. We must return to the week following my discovery in the corporate archives. Finding the sealed addendum was only the initial phase. I needed a legal scalpel to pry it open. I knew better than to use any counsel associated with Harrison Logistics. The family retained a fleet of corporate attorneys who owed their exorbitant billing hours to Richard. If I even placed a phone call to one of their partners, Victoria would know about it before the hour ended. I required an independent entity. I researched probate specialists in Delaware and found a litigator named Elias Sterling. He operated out of a modest glass-fronted office in Dover, far removed from the Wilmington social elite. Sterling possessed a reputation for dismantling complex corporate trusts. And more importantly, he did not care about the Rodriguez surname. I paid his retainer using my own savings. I sat in his minimalist conference room, handed him the dossier number, and gave him a single directive. I told him to unseal the addendum attached to my adoption decree. It took Sterling 5 days to navigate the probate courts. When he finally summoned me back to his office, He did not offer a greeting. He simply slid a certified, unredacted copy of the document across his desk. The heavy boulder of my family dynamic dropped the moment my eyes scanned the first paragraph. Grandfather Harrison had engineered a masterful posthumous trap. The document was the foundational charter of the Harrison Irrevocable Contingency Trust. It dictated the exact terms of Richard's inheritance. Grandfather Harrison built his shipping empire from the ground up, driving trucks through winter storms long before he ever wore a bespoke suit. He understood the value of grit. He also understood that his son Richard was born on third base and believed he had hit a triple. Harrison viewed Richard as soft, entitled, and easily manipulated by a status-obsessed woman like Victoria. Harrison refused to hand over the voting shares of his empire to a man who lacked basic human empathy. He instituted a strict non-negotiable condition to inherit the controlling stake of the logistics firm. Richard was required to adopt and raise a child in need before his 30th birthday. Furthermore, the charter mandated that Richard treat this child as an equal heir alongside any biological children he might produce. I was the compliance measure. I was the living, breathing metric needed to hit to secure his chief executive title. He finalized my adoption a mere 4 months before his 30th birthday. He met the deadline. The trust dispersed the preliminary assets and Richard assumed control of the company. But Grandfather Harrison possessed a deep cynical wisdom. He knew Victoria would never accept me. He predicted she would turn my existence into a ledger item, marginalizing me the moment the initial inheritance cleared. To protect his investment, Harrison installed a poison pill within the architecture of the trust. The clause was buried on page 42. Written in dense, unyielding legal parameters. It stated that if at any point before my 28th birthday, I was legally severed from the family, disinherited, or pressured to relinquish my status by my adoptive parents, a devastating financial penalty would automatically trigger. In that event, 60% of the firm's Class A voting shares would immediately and irrevocably vest to me. The shares would bypass Richard entirely. 60% meant majority control. It meant the power to liquidate assets, rewrite corporate bylaws, and terminate the chief executive officer. The timeline laid out in the document provided sudden crystal clearer clarity regarding the dinner invitation at the Vanguard. My 28th birthday was exactly 3 weeks away. According to the trust charter, if I reached my 28th birthday without incident, the contingency clause would expire. The trust would dissolve into Richard's unrestricted control, securing the empire for Lauren. Victoria and Richard were running out of time. They wanted me permanently excised from the family tree so Lauren would face 0 future challenges to the estate. But they could not simply throw me out because a forced disinheritance would trigger the poison pill. They needed me to walk away voluntarily. That was the true purpose of the $50,000 waiver resting on the table in the private dining room. Victoria's corporate lawyers had drafted a document designed to look like a standard benign severance agreement. By signing it, I would be legally acknowledging that I was leaving the family of my own free will, waiving all claims to any known or unknown trusts. The signature would nullify Harrison's trap. They were offering me pennies to surrender a shipping empire. It was a calculated risk on their part. Victoria assumed I was financially illiterate. She looked at me and saw the quiet, compliant girl who never demanded a birthday party or a new car. She saw a pushover. She severely underestimated the risk actuary who spent her entire adult life auditing their fraudulent ledgers. Sitting in Elias Sterling's office, reading the exact mechanics of my own worth, the lingering emotional betrayal faded into the background. A normal daughter might have wept at the realization that her family only tolerated her to secure a trust fund. But I stopped seeking Victoria's maternal affection the day she handed me the itemized bill for my high school extracurriculars. The hurt was secondary. The math was absolute. I traced the signature on the bottom of the unredacted trust document. The ink was old, but the power it held was vibrant and lethal. I now possessed the schematic to their ruin. All I had to do was survive the next 3 weeks without signing away my rights. Better yet, I needed to manipulate them into explicitly forcing the severance, thereby triggering the acceleration clause on my own terms. Sterling watched me process the information. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his silver-framed glasses. He asked if I wanted him to draft a protective injunction to block any upcoming moves my parents might make. I shook my head. I told him an injunction would only alert them that I knew about the trap. If you want to catch a predator, you do not board up the door. You leave it wide open and wait for them to walk inside. I instructed Sterling to keep the unredacted file secure in his vault. I only requested a single certified copy to carry with me. I placed the heavy parchment into a plain manila folder. The same manila folder currently resting by my water glass at the Vanguard. But the contingency trust was not the only secret Sterling unearthed that morning. When a judge unseals a probate file, the entire history comes into the light. Attached behind the trust charter was the original intake paperwork from the private adoption agency. The documents Victoria had tried so hard to bury. The intake forms detailed the exact transaction, the exorbitant fees transferred from the Rodriguez estate, the predatory tactics used by the agency to secure a newborn for a wealthy client facing a looming birthday deadline. And printed on the very last page under a section marked for biological origin was a name. It was a name that would add a profound, unpredictable variable to my calculations. A name that would shift my strategy from a sterile corporate takeover into a deeply personal reckoning. Finding the trust gave me the weapon. Finding the name gave me the reason to use it. I drove home from Sterling's office with the manila folder resting on my passenger seat. The rain had stopped, leaving the Delaware highway slick and reflective. I kept glancing at the closed cardboard flap. I knew what the financial documents meant for my future. But the name printed on the intake form required an entirely different kind of investigation. It required me to step out of the spreadsheets and confront the human element of my own history. The name on the paper was Elena Rodriguez. And finding her was about to change the power dynamic of my impending birthday far more than 60% of any shipping empire ever could. Uncovering the financial trap at the county records office provided me with a lethal corporate weapon. The contingency clause engineered by Grandfather Harrison gave me the power to dismantle a shipping empire. But the private adoption agency intake form resting in my hands offered something far more profound. It offered context. Printed on the bottom line of the faded yellow paper under a section designating biological origin was a name. Elena Rodriguez. We shared the same surname by sheer coincidence or perhaps an act of bureaucratic fate. As a risk actuary, I do not believe in fate. I believe in probability raw data and the inevitable consequences of hidden variables. Staring at that name, a new equation formed in my mind. If I was the acquired asset Richard purchased to unlock his trust fund, who was the woman forced to supply that asset? I could not simply look her up in a phone directory and knock on a front door. That approach carried too high a margin for error. 7 months prior to the dinner at the Vanguard, I needed clean, objective intelligence. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Trent, a former fraud examiner who specialized in tracing obscured identities. I met him in a quiet diner on the outskirts of Wilmington, slid a copy of the agency intake form across the booth, and gave him a single directive. I told him to find the teenage girl from 27 years ago. While Marcus went to work, I braced myself for the highest probability outcome. When you analyze human behavior for a living, you learn to prepare for the worst. The agency Victoria utilized was notorious for exploiting the vulnerable. I expected Marcus to return with a dossier detailing a broken life. I calculated the likelihood of finding a woman trapped in systemic poverty, struggling with addiction, or burdened by the lasting trauma of forced separation. I even drafted a private budget setting aside a portion of my own salary to offer her an anonymous monthly stipend if she turned out to be destitute. I viewed the impending reunion as a high-risk emotional investment, a liability I was willing to absorb out of a strange lingering sense of duty. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me back to the diner. He did not hand me a thin folder containing eviction notices or court records. He slid a thick, heavy portfolio across the table. He told me I owed him double his usual rate because the woman he tracked down was not hiding in the shadows. She was standing in the spotlight. I opened the portfolio. The first page contained a crisp, high-resolution photograph. It showed a woman standing in front of a sleek modern commercial production facility. The polished steel sign above the entrance read, "Ironclad Artisan Bakes." The woman in the photo wore a tailored blazer over a pristine white chef apron. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sharp twist. Her posture radiated a quiet, undeniable authority. She shared my jawline, the distinct curve of my cheekbones, and the steady assessing gaze I saw in the mirror every morning. Marcus narrated the contents of the file while I stared at the photograph. Elena Rodriguez lived just 40 minutes away in Newark, Delaware. She was not a liability. She was a self-made titan. She started her career baking breads in a cramped, unventilated apartment kitchen while working 3 separate minimum wage jobs. Through sheer grit and an unmatched head for logistics, she scaled her modest operation into a regional supply chain. She currently owned a highly successful network of commercial bakeries providing artisan pastries and raw dough to elite restaurants and luxury hotels across the entire eastern seaboard. Her business was valued in the tens of millions. She commanded a fleet of delivery trucks, managed hundreds of employees, and sat on the board of 3 regional commerce committees. My biological mother was a powerhouse. But the dossier contained darker truths buried in the history of her ascent. Marcus had dug into the archives of the private adoption agency. He uncovered the specific mechanics of the transaction Victoria and Richard funded. Elelina had been 17 years old when she walked into that clinic. She was a brilliant but isolated high school student carrying a child she could not afford to deliver in a conventional hospital. The agency identified her as a prime target. They systematically cornered her, offering to cover her mounting medical debts under the strict condition that she sign a binding surrender clause upon delivery. The exorbitant fees Richard wired to the agency fueled this predatory machine. They preyed on a terrified teenager, stripping her of her choices to supply a wealthy couple with the loophole they needed to secure an inheritance. Victoria did not rescue a child from the gutter. She funded an extraction. She weaponized her wealth to exploit a vulnerable girl, sitting in the diner, absorbing the reality of Elena's history. A deep, satisfying layer of dramatic irony settled over my impending conflict. Victoria spent her days curating a country club aesthetic. She measured a person's worth by their pedigree, the designer labels they wore, and the generational wealth they inherited. Throughout my childhood, she constantly lobbed veiled insults regarding my origins. She whispered to her socialite friends that I came from questionable stock, implying my biological roots were tainted by failure and low-class struggles. She prided herself on her aristocratic superiority, looking down her nose at anyone who actually worked for a living. Yet Victoria produced Lauren, a daughter who spent her weekdays online shopping, siphoning credit for my labor and drinking expensive wine she never earned. Lauren was the true liability, a parasitic drain on a company built by someone else. Meanwhile, the woman Victoria treated as an invisible discarded vessel had built a legitimate empire from flour, water, and heat. Elena did not marry into her wealth. She did not need a trust fund or a predatory loophole to secure her status. She forged it with her own calloused hands. She was an equal player in the corporate arena, standing just out of frame. entirely unknown to the arrogant matriarch who thought she held all the cards. The power dynamic in my mind fundamentally shifted. I had spent my entire life craving Victoria's validation, shrinking myself to fit into the sterile transactional box she assigned me. Looking at the photograph of Elena, that craving evaporated. I held the legal trap required to dismantle Richard's logistics empire. But Elena represented something far more dangerous to my adoptive family. She represented the emotional weapon required to destroy Victoria's fragile, inflated ego. If Victoria believed her ultimate victory would involve casting me out into the cold, she was operating on flawed data. She thought I would leave the vanguard broken and alone. She had no idea that discarding me would merely send me walking directly into the ranks of a superior self-made dynasty. Having the intelligence is only the first step in risk management. Acting on the data requires stepping out of the theoretical realm and exposing yourself to actual human vulnerability. I knew Elena's net worth. I knew the location of her flagship facility. I knew the traumatic circumstances of our separation. What I did not know was how she would react if the child she was forced to surrender suddenly walked through the front doors of her bakery. I needed to calculate the human variable. I had to know if the fierce authoritative woman in the photograph would look at me with indifference, regret, or recognition. I paid Marcus for his services, gathered the dossier, and walked out to my car. The numbers told a compelling story. But numbers cannot hold a conversation. The time for silent audits was over. I had to meet her. I had to see if there was a place for me in the empire she built before I burned Richard and Victoria's empire to the ground. I drove to Newark on a quiet Sunday morning. The sky was the color of bruised iron shedding a fine, persistent mist over the interstate. The address Marcus Trent provided led me to an industrial park on the edge of the city. Ironclad artisan bakes occupied a sprawling corner lot. The loading docks were empty. The delivery fleet parked in neat uniform rows for the weekend. I pulled my car into the visitor slot and turned off the engine. I sat behind the steering wheel for 20 minutes, listening to the rain tap against the windshield. My actuary training taught me to compartmentalize fear, to view it merely as a physiological response to an unquantifiable variable. But my hands gripped the leather steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I was terrified. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the glass front doors. The main production floor was closed to the public, but the lights in the administrative wing glowed a warm, steady yellow. I knocked on the glass. A moment later, a woman emerged from the hallway. She wore a simple white chef coat over dark denim. Her hair was tied back, revealing the sharp angles of her jaw. It was the woman from the photograph. It was Elena. She unlocked the door and pushed it open, wiping flour from her hands with a clean towel. She looked at me, a polite, questioning smile forming on her lips, assuming I was a lost vendor or a confused customer. Then her eyes locked onto mine. The polite smile vanished. The towel slipped from her fingers, landing silently on the polished concrete floor. I stood in the entryway, rain dripping from the hem of my coat. I had prepared a speech. I spent hours drafting a sterile objective introduction to explain the private agency, the sealed records, and the timeline of my birth. I opened my mouth to recite the data. Elelenina took a step forward, closing the distance between us. She did not ask for my name. She did not demand an explanation request, a DNA test, or inquire about my financial status. She reached out with trembling hands and gently cupped the sides of my face. Her palms were warm, smelling faintly of toasted yeast and vanilla. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against mine, and whispered that she had saved a seat at her table for 27 years. She guided me out of the sterile entryway and into the employee break room. The space featured a long stainless steel prep table surrounded by metal stools. Elena pulled out a stool. She did not point to the far end of the room. She did not dictate my placement from a distance. She pulled out the stool directly next to her own. Our shoulders nearly touched as we sat down. The symbolism struck me with the force of a physical blow. At the Rodriguez estate, my designated chair was always positioned at the extreme edge of the mahogany dining table. Victoria engineered the geography of our meals to ensure a physical barrier existed between the blood family and the acquired asset. I was tolerated in the room, but I was never granted proximity. Elena offered me the exact opposite. She offered me the space right beside her, eliminating the gap I had navigated my entire life. Over the next 7 months, we built a relationship hidden within the shadows of my corporate routine. I spent my weekdays auditing shipping manifests in Wilmington, maintaining the facade of the quiet, compliant daughter. But my weekends belonged to Newark. I sat in Elena's commercial kitchen watching her manage her bakery empire with the same calculating precision I used to manage risk portfolios. We talked for hours. I experienced the unfamiliar sensation of sharing my reality without filtering it for Victoria's approval. I told Elena about the transactional nature of my upbringing. I described the morning Victoria handed me the itemized ledger outlining the cost of my high school existence. I explained how Richard enabled the isolation, shielding himself behind his executive title, while his wife treated me like a depreciating liability. Elena did not offer empty platitudes. She listened with the intense, focused stillness of a chief executive auditing a rival firm. When I described the ledger, her eyes darkened with a cold, righteous fury. She understood the exact cruelty of reducing a child to a profit and loss statement. During our 4th meeting, I brought the plain manila folder containing Grandfather Harrison's unredacted trust charter. I laid the heavy parchment on the stainless steel table between our coffee mugs. I walked her through the dense legal framework, pointing out the specific metrics required for Richard to secure his inheritance. I showed her the poison pill buried on page 42, detailing how a forced severance before my 28th birthday would strip Richard of his voting shares and vest 60% of the logistics empire directly to me. Elena read the document twice. She traced the red wax seal with her index finger. A slow, sharp smile spread across her face. She recognized the brilliance of Theostomus Trapp. As a woman who built her own wealth from the ground up, she appreciated the ruthless genius of a founder, protecting his legacy from an entitled heir. Elena became my anchor. Her presence altered the fundamental math of my existence. For 27 years, the threat of Victoria's rejection hung over my head like a pendulum. I shrank myself, performed the grueling corporate labor in the background, and accepted the isolation because I believed the Rodriguez estate was the only foundation I possessed. I thought losing their minimal tolerance meant stepping out into a void. Elena filled the void. I experienced what unconditional love actually felt like. It was not a budget. It was not a tax write-off. It was a seat saved at a table waiting for me regardless of what I produced. I no longer feared losing Victoria and Richard. I did not care if they kicked me out of the estate, stripped my name from their holiday cards, or badmouthed me to their country club peers. Armed with Elena's steadfast emotional support and Grandfather Harrison's lethal legal trap, my defensive posture dissolved. I held every card required to win the game. But holding the winning hand is useless if the opponent refuses to place a bet. The clock was ticking. My 28th birthday was rapidly approaching. If I reached that date without incident, the contingency clause would expire. The trust would dissolve. Richard would gain permanent, unrestricted control over the shipping empire in Victoria, would have the freedom to discard me without facing a single financial consequence. I could not sit back and wait for them to act on their own timeline. I had to seize control of the board. I needed to bait Victoria and Richard into springing the trap early. I needed to force them to execute a formal legal severance before the deadline. To manipulate an opponent into making a fatal error, you must offer them an incentive they cannot resist. You must present them with a vulnerability that triggers their greed. I realized I needed more leverage to force their hand. I needed a catalyst powerful enough to make Victoria arrogant and reckless. My actuary training reminded me that the most reliable predictor of future behavior is hidden in the current financial data. If I wanted to push the Rodriguez family over the edge, I needed to look beyond Richard's inheritance. I needed to examine the golden child. I needed to audit Lauren's accounts. I sat at the glass desk in my apartment on a quiet Thursday night. The city lights of Wilmington reflected off the dark window panes, casting a faint amber glow across my living room. 2 large monitors illuminated my face. I had a singular objective for the evening. If Grandfather Harrison's posthumous trap functioned as designed, I would soon control a majority stake in a regional shipping empire. As a risk actuary, I never acquire an asset without calculating its precise current valuation. I needed to know exactly what Harrison Logistics was worth down to the final decimal point. I logged into the primary corporate database using my remote administrative credentials. The numbers usually tell a clean, predictable story. A healthy logistics firm generates a steady rhythm of data involving cargo volume, diesel fuel costs, fleet maintenance, and maritime insurance premiums. I cross-referenced the quarterly operational overhead against the incoming freight revenues. The margins appeared stable on the surface. But when I shifted my focus to the internal departmental budgets, the mathematical rhythm fractured. The disruption originated in the compliance department. Lauren held the title of Senior Vice President of Compliance. In a standard corporate structure, a regulatory department operates as a static cost center. The expenses should remain relatively flat, consisting of payroll, software licenses, and routine legal consultations. Instead, the cash outflows from Lauren's division resembled a volatile, high-risk hedge fund. The quarterly expenditures spiked with erratic, unpredictable surges. I leaned closer to the monitor. I extracted the raw ledger data for the past 36 months and isolated the vendor payouts. There were 3 distinct consulting firms billing Harrison Logistics for specialized monthly regulatory audits. The invoices featured vague generalized descriptions: safety protocol alignment, maritime risk assessment, federal tariff consulting. I ran the tax identification digits for these 3 specific entities. The digital trail bypassed standard domestic registries and routed directly to a registered agent located in the Cayman Islands. A legitimate mid-Atlantic shipping firm does not outsource routine domestic safety audits to offshore shell companies. I typed a new sequence of commands, bypassing the primary firewall to access the outbound wire transfer logs. I followed the money. The funds bounced through a secondary holding account in the Caribbean before depositing directly into a private wealth management fund. I needed to know who controlled that final destination account. I accessed the metadata attached to the original invoice authorization signatures. The digital fingerprints matched the IP address of the executive suite on the top floor of our Wilmington headquarters. It was Lauren's office. My hands went still over the keyboard. I stared at the screen, letting the magnitude of the discovery settle into my mind. The golden child was stealing from her own future inheritance. The immediate question was why. Lauren earned a staggering 6-figure salary for doing essentially nothing. She lived rent-free in a luxury condominium owned by the firm. Her material needs were entirely covered. I opened a new browser window and pulled up her public digital footprint. Lauren drove a $100,000 sports car. She took spontaneous weekend trips to Monaco, Macau, and Las Vegas. Victoria constantly praised her biological daughter to the country club elite, claiming Lauren possessed a brilliant natural instinct for high-yield investments. Victoria treated Lauren's lavish lifestyle as proof of her superior genetic pedigree. The truth was buried in the outbound routing numbers on my monitor. The offshore wealth management fund was not holding the stolen cash in a high-yield portfolio. The account was regularly hemorrhaging large, frantic wire transfers to a syndicate of high-stakes online casinos and luxury creditors. Lauren was not a market genius. She possessed a crippling gambling debt. She was an addict bleeding her family dry to maintain the fragile illusion of elite success. I pulled the executive approval logs to understand how this monumental theft went unnoticed for 3 years. Richard was the chief executive officer. Corporate bylaws required his physical signature for any departmental budget increase exceeding $50,000. I scanned the archives. Richard had authorized every single ghost invoice. He never read them. He simply saw his daughter's name on the request line and stamped his approval. He was too lazy to perform a basic quarterly review, too cowardly to question his beloved child, and too eager to return to his expensive scotch and his golf swing. He signed away hundreds of thousands of dollars blindly. The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. Victoria spent my entire life reminding me that I was a defective asset. She treated me as an outsider, lacking the pristine, superior makeup of the Rodriguez lineage. She worshipped the ground Lauren walked on, viewing her biological daughter as the flawless embodiment of generational wealth. Victoria marginalized me because I did not share their blood. Yet, the pristine bloodline was actively bankrupting the family empire. I was the acquired charity case, spending my nights doing the grueling mathematical labor to keep the company compliant and afloat. Meanwhile, the trueborn heir siphoned the profits to pay off blackjack losses on another continent. A forensic accountant does not just uncover a crime. A forensic accountant builds an airtight, undeniable prosecution. I spent the next 4 nights meticulously documenting every fraudulent wire transfer. I downloaded the fabricated Cayman Island invoices, the internal IP authorization logs, and the corresponding casino debt markers. I compiled the evidence into a comprehensive digital dossier. I encrypted the file using military-grade software and uploaded the package to an off-site secure server. I held the sole decryption key. This discovery elevated my strategy from a simple corporate takeover to a total systemic dismantling. I was no longer just preparing to claim my rightful 60% share of the logistics empire under Grandfather Harrison's trap. I was preparing to prove that Victoria and Richard had handed the keys of the kingdom to a thief. When the truth emerged, the board of directors would not just fire Lauren. They would demand criminal prosecution. The pristine family legacy Victoria guarded so fiercely would become a front-page scandal in the Financial Times. I leaned back in my desk chair and closed my laptop. I had the sword provided by Grandfather Harrison. I had the shield forged by Lauren's own greed. The trap was fully constructed, loaded with enough lethal leverage to wipe the slate clean. But a trap is a useless piece of machinery if the prey ignores the bait. My 28th birthday was rapidly approaching. The countdown was in the single digits. If I sat back and waited for Victoria and Richard to act, they might delay the formal severance until the contingency clause expired. They might push the paperwork after the deadline, leaving me with nothing but the embezzlement files. I could not leave the timeline to chance. I needed to engineer a scenario that would make Victoria feel invincible. I needed her to believe I was weak, financially desperate, and willing to sign away my legal rights for a fraction of their actual worth. I had to orchestrate the perfect illusion of failure. I needed to ask my father for money, to force their hand. I deployed a classic red herring. In the world of risk management, an adversary will always prioritize their own confirmation bias over objective data. People like Victoria thrive on the perceived weakness of others. Her entire identity was built on the premise that her bloodline was superior and my origins were inherently flawed. If I projected strength, If I walked into their house radiating financial independence and quiet confidence, she would hesitate. She would sense the friction. A predator does not attack prey that stares back without flinching. If she felt I was secure, she would delay the severance. She would wait out the clock until my 28th birthday passed, letting Grandfather Harrison's contingency clause expire safely into the ether. I had to manufacture a crisis. I needed to present myself as a bleeding asset. I had to offer her an incentive so coated in greed that she would abandon caution and rush the timeline. 2 weeks before the dinner at the Vanguard, I left my apartment and drove to the Harrison Logistics corporate campus. I did not wear my usual tailored office attire. I chose a faded grey trench coat and pulled my hair into a loose haphazard knot. I needed to look the part of a woman buckling under the weight of her own poor decisions. I rode the glass elevator to the executive floor, bypassing Lauren's empty office suite, and knocked softly on Richard's heavy oak door. He called for me to enter. I stepped into the sprawling office. The room smelled of expensive leather polish and the sharp tang of citrus cologne. Richard was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, practicing his golf putt on a custom green rolled out across the carpet. He did not look up when the door clicked shut. He merely asked what I needed, his tone laced with his usual mild irritation. I kept my posture slouched. I directed my gaze toward the floorboards, avoiding direct eye contact. I forced my voice to carry a slight synthetic tremor. I told him I had made a terrible mistake. I explained that I had poured my savings into a volatile real estate venture that had suddenly collapsed. I claimed I was facing immediate eviction from my apartment and drowning in short-term debt. I asked my adoptive father for a $10,000 loan. The story was a complete fabrication. My actuary salary was substantial, sitting safely in a diversified, low-risk portfolio. My rent was paid 6 months in advance. But Richard never bothered to ask about my career or my personal finances. He assumed my bank account was as meager as his affection for me. He stopped his putting stroke. He leaned the titanium golf club against the edge of his mahogany desk. He looked at me and I watched the micro-expressions shift across his face. He did not display parental concern. He did not ask how I ended up in such a precarious position or offer a comforting word. Instead, a distinct quiet satisfaction settled into his shoulders. My manufactured failure validated the narrative he and Victoria had constructed over 2 decades. It proved the acquired charity case was fundamentally flawed. It relieved him of any lingering guilt regarding how they treated me. If I was a failure, then their neglect was simply an accurate prediction, not a moral failing. He cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive watch. He told me liquidity was tight this quarter. It was a lie considering the revenue reports I audited the previous night. But I nodded as if I believed him. He stated he could not write a check of that magnitude without consulting Victoria. He said they needed to evaluate my financial irresponsibility as a family. I thanked him, keeping my head bowed, and walked out of the executive suite. The bait was in the water. I knew exactly what would happen the moment Richard returned to the estate. He would pour his evening scotch, locate Victoria in the drawing room and tell his wife that the stray they purchased was begging for a lifeline. Victoria would hear the number, $10,000, to her. It was the price of a seasonal designer handbag. But to a desperate person, it was a fortune. Her predatory instincts would ignite. The math in her head would restructure itself. Why wait out the clock for my birthday? Why leave anything to chance and risk a future claim on the estate? If I was facing eviction, I would be vulnerable. I would be panicked. I would sign away my birthright for a quick cash injection just to keep a roof over my head. She would see a golden opportunity to permanently excise me from the family ledger for pennies on the dollar. She would want to execute the severance immediately, striking while she believed I had zero leverage. The confirmation arrived less than 48 hours later. My phone illuminated with a text message from Victoria. She did not call. She preferred the sterile documented distance of digital communication. The message was brief and devoid of warmth. She stated that my financial situation was unacceptable and required an immediate permanent resolution. She ordered me to meet them at the Vanguard on Friday evening. She called it a special dinner to discuss my future. I stared at the glowing screen. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. By feigning weakness, I dictated the battlefield. I controlled the timeline. They believed they were arranging an ambush to discard a failing daughter. They assumed they held all the power, summoning me to their preferred arena. The Vanguard was Victoria's sanctuary, a place where she felt untouchable among the velvet curtains and the wealthy elite. She thought the opulent setting would intimidate me into quiet compliance. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a meticulously orchestrated audit. I was not the prey. I was the architect of their ruin. And they had just handed me the master key. I needed to position my final piece on the board. I picked up my phone and dialed Elena. She answered on the second ring. The background noise of her commercial bakery hummed through the speaker. A symphony of industrial mixers and shouting line cooks. I told her the timeline had accelerated. I explained the trap I laid in Richard's office and confirmed that Victoria had swallowed the bait. I gave her the address for the Vanguard and the precise time of the reservation. I instructed her to wear something that projected unambiguous corporate authority. I told her to arrive 15 minutes early, sit in the restaurant lobby, order a drink, and wait for my text message. Elena did not hesitate. She did not question the theatrics or express any anxiety over confronting the woman who purchased her child 27 years ago. She possessed the cold, focused energy of a woman ready to reclaim her stolen property. She simply asked if I was prepared to close the ledger. I told her I had never been more prepared for anything in my life. The pieces were locked into their designated squares. The trap was primed. Loaded with Grandfather Harrison's poison pill, Lauren's embezzlement files, and Elena's undeniable presence. But before I sat down at that candlelit table, duty required me to drop off the final monthly compliance reports at the Rodriguez estate. I had to walk through their halls one last time, and during that brief visit, I would overhear a conversation that proved exactly how little they understood the storm heading their way. 2 days before the scheduled dinner, I drove to the Rodriguez estate in Greenville. The wrought iron gates swung open with a quiet mechanical hum. The driveway was paved with crushed white gravel that crunched under my tires. Victoria employed a landscaping crew that kept every blade of grass cut to a uniform length. The hedges were shaped into rigid geometric squares. Nothing was allowed to grow wild or untamed on this property. It was a physical manifestation of her need for total control. I parked my car near the detached garage. I held a stack of manila folders in my hands. These were the final monthly compliance reports for Harrison Logistics. I had balanced the accounts and drafted the executive summaries late into the night. It would be the last piece of uncredited labor I ever performed for Richard. I used my keypad code to unlock the side entrance. The mudroom smelled of lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements. The air inside the house always felt filtered and sterile. I walked through the kitchen. My flat shoes made zero sound on the imported marble floor. The house was usually empty during the mid-afternoon. Richard would be at the golf course. Lauren typically spent her days at an upscale fitness club. I planned to drop the folders on the hall table and leave without interacting with anyone. As I moved down the main corridor toward the foyer, the faint sound of voices drifted through the open double doors of the mahogany study. I stopped walking. I pressed my back against the silk wallpaper. I stood in the shadows just outside the doorframe. The study was Grandfather Harrison's old sanctuary. Victoria had long since replaced his antique leather chairs with modern velvet sofas. The room lost its character the day she redecorated. I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses touching. Lauren was laughing. It was a sharp nasal sound. She spoke with the casual disregard of a woman who had never faced a single consequence in her entire life. She took a sip of her drink. She said 50,000 is generous. She swirled the liquid in her glass. She sneered that I would snatch the money up to pay my rent. She told her mother they would finally be rid of the charity case before my birthday even arrived. Victoria let out a low hum of agreement. Her voice carried the smooth practice tone of a successful corporate raider closing a lucrative deal. She told Lauren to be patient. She said once I signed the severance waiver on Friday night, the trust would belong to them without any conditions. She laid out the final phase of her strategy out loud. She explained that with my legal status severed, Richard could finally transfer the voting shares of Harrison Logistics directly to Lauren. The legacy would be secured. The bloodline would remain pure. I stood perfectly still in the hallway. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. I did not possess a burning desire to walk into the room and confront them. I felt the cool, detached satisfaction of a mathematician observing a flawed equation. The dramatic irony of the moment possessed a distinct poetic quality. They were sitting inside the study sipping expensive liquor. They were congratulating themselves on a flawless victory. They believed their strategy was impenetrable. They thought my fabricated story about the real estate collapse and the impending eviction was genuine. They assumed I was a desperate failing woman who would eagerly trade a shipping empire for a few months of living expenses. They were popping champagne on the deck of a sinking ship. They were celebrating a voyage that had already struck the iceberg. Victoria built her entire reality on the assumption that she held the superior intellect. She viewed her biological daughter as a brilliant successor. Yet the brilliant successor sitting across from her was currently funneling hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars into offshore accounts to cover casino debts. The matriarch who prided herself on controlling every variable was entirely oblivious to the rot destroying her own house from the inside. They were plotting my demise with supreme unearned confidence. They had no idea that I held the unredacted trust documents drafted by Grandfather Harrison. They did not know I possessed the encrypted server keys containing the definitive proof of Lauren's embezzlement. They failed to realize that presenting me with a formal severance waiver would not secure their wealth. It would trigger the exact acceleration clause designed to strip them of everything they owned. I looked down at the compliance folders in my hands. The pages contained the accurate balanced numbers of a logistics firm. But the true ledger was the one I carried in my mind. The debt Victoria and Richard owed me had accrued interest for 27 years. The payment was coming due on Friday evening. I did not step into the study. I did not interrupt their celebration. Revealing my hand in the hallway would ruin the meticulous timeline I had constructed. I needed them to bring the official paperwork to the Vanguard. I needed them to initiate the legal severance in a formal setting. I moved silently away from the doorframe. I walked to the marble console table in the foyer and set the compliance folders down next to a silver decorative tray. I turned around and retraced my steps through the quiet, sterile corridors of the estate. I opened the side door and stepped back out into the driveway. The crisp Delaware air hit my face. It carried the scent of damp pine needles and impending autumn. The sunlight broke through the overcast sky. It cast long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawn. I walked to my car with my posture straight and my breathing slow and steady. Let them gloat. Let them sit in their velvet chairs and toast to their imaginary triumph. The fundamental law of physics dictates that the higher you build a pedestal, the more devastating the gravitational pull becomes when the structure cracks. They were building their pedestal all the way to the clouds. I was simply holding the sledgehammer, waiting for the right moment to swing. The next 48 hours passed in a quiet blur of routine preparation. I went to my office. I analyzed my risk portfolios. I finalized the logistical details with Elena. I slept soundly, undisturbed by anxiety or doubt. When Friday evening arrived, I put on a tailored navy suit. I placed the plain manila folder and Grandfather Harrison's silver fountain pen into my leather tote bag. I drove downtown to the restaurant. That brings us back to the private dining room. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Vanguard and observed the scene Victoria had prepared. The geography of the table was the opening move of her final offensive. She placed Lauren at Richard's right hand. She pulled their chairs close together to present a united, impenetrable front. She relegated my seat to the far end of the long mahogany table. She ensured a physical barrier existed between the blood family and the acquired asset. The air in the room was tense and heavy. Before the waiters even brought out the first course, Victoria reached for her glass. She was preparing to raise a toast. She was ready to announce a phantom promotion. It was a hollow title designed to elevate the thief while diminishing the actuary. The trap was officially opening. I sat down quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for them to walk right in. The private dining room at the Vanguard smelled of melted beeswax and roasted garlic. A low-frequency hum of muted jazz drifted through the hidden ceiling speakers, providing a sophisticated soundtrack for a family execution. I sat in my designated chair, observing the scene with the detached focus of an auditor reviewing a preliminary balance sheet. Victoria orchestrated the seating arrangement with deliberate surgical precision. The geography of the mahogany table served as a physical manifestation of her hierarchy. Richard occupied the head of the table, a position of hollow authority. Lauren sat anchored to his right side. Her chair pulled so near to his that their shoulders almost brushed. My adoptive mother presided opposite them, anchoring the center, commanding the sightlines. My seat resided at the farthest opposite end. Between my plate and their unified front stretched 5 feet of empty, polished wood. Victoria engineered this physical gulf to send a clear psychological message. I was allowed in the room, but I remained an outsider. I was a spectator to their dynasty. Separated by an invisible boundary I was never meant to cross. A waiter, dressed in a crisp black vest, entered the room, carrying a silver tray of a pair of teeths. Victoria dismissed him with a brief sharp wave of her hand. She instructed him to close the heavy oak doors and not return until summoned. The latch clicked shut, sealing us inside the velvet-lined vault. The air grew dense. Richard stared intently at his crystal glass, swirling the amber liquid, finding intense fascination in the melting ice. He refused to glance in my direction. Lauren, meanwhile, radiated a smug, restless energy. She wore a new diamond tennis bracelet, the gems catching the dim light every time she shifted her wrist. I recognized the design. It was a recent purchase, likely funded by the ghost invoices routed through the Cayman Islands. Victoria cleared her throat. The sound was soft, yet it commanded immediate obedience. She reached for her tall champagne flute. She did not look at her husband. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. She announced that she wanted to begin the evening with a celebration. She stated that the past few years required difficult transitions, but the firm was finally positioned for a new era of leadership. A smile stretched across her face, thin and practiced. She raised her glass toward Lauren. She declared that effective Monday morning, Lauren would officially assume the title of Chief Operating Officer for Harrison Logistics. The promotion was a masterclass in corporate negligence. In a functional, legitimate enterprise, the Chief Operating Officer manages the daily rhythm of the supply chain, oversees fleet logistics, and mitigates structural risks. It requires grueling hours, a razor-sharp intellect, and an intimate understanding of complex maritime regulations. Lauren did not possess a single one of those qualifications. She viewed the shipping empire as a personal automated teller machine. Her previous role as Senior Vice President of Compliance involved long lunches, online retail browsing, and signing her name to the meticulous frameworks I secretly drafted for her. Promoting her to the second highest executive tier was the equivalent of handing the vault combination to a known bank robber. Richard was elevating a woman who spent the last 36 months siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover illicit gambling debts. Victoria raised her flute an inch higher, her gaze fixed on my face, searching for a fracture in my composure. She offered a toast to blood, she said, her voice dropping to a low triumphant purr, and to the future of the Harrison legacy. Lauren beamed, lifting her own glass, drinking the expensive vintage with the arrogant ease of an heir inheriting a kingdom. Richard took a fast, guilty swallow of his scotch. They waited for my reaction. Victoria expected me to lower my eyes. She wanted me to exhibit the bitter sting of jealousy. She craved the visible proof that her maneuver had wounded me, reinforcing my status as the discarded, underperforming asset. She thrived on the friction of my perceived insecurity. I did not offer her the friction she desired. I reached for my crystal tumbler of sparkling water. I lifted the glass, acknowledging the toast with a slow, deliberate nod. I offered my congratulations to Lauren. I kept my vocal tone entirely flat, stripped of any emotional inflection. I stated that I was certain she would manage the company finances exactly as they deserve to be managed. The double entendre hung suspended in the quiet air of the dining room. Lauren smirked, absorbing the statement as a genuine compliment. She tossed her hair over her shoulder, thanking me with a patronizing tilt of her chin. She lacked the fundamental self-awareness required to detect the underlying threat. She thought I was bowing to her superior rank. Victoria, however, possessed a sharper instinct. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She detected the absence of defeat in my posture. She noticed my heart rate remained steady, my hands resting effortlessly on the white linen, betraying zero signs of anxiety. My stoicism disrupted the narrative she had carefully drafted. I was supposed to be a desperate, failing woman facing eviction, begging for a lifeline. I was not supposed to issue calm, cryptic congratulations. The lack of visible distress irritated the matriarch. She needed to break my shell. She needed to assert her dominance and remind me of the vast insurmountable gap between my manufactured failure and their pristine success. She leaned across the table, her eyes narrowing into dark slits. She adopted a tone of mock pity laced with undeniable venom. She asked if I was curious about the compensation package. She prodded me, wondering aloud why I was not asking how much money my sister would be making in her prestigious new executive role. Victoria wanted to flaunt the wealth. She wanted to use Lauren's unearned salary as a blunt instrument to highlight my own fabricated poverty. She expected me to shrink back, humiliated by the contrast between Lauren's millions and the $10,000 loan I had requested just 2 weeks prior. I set my water glass down on the table. The base connected with the wood, producing a soft, definitive thud. I met Victoria's gaze, holding the eye contact until she blinked. I told her I did not need to ask about the salary. I kept my voice smooth, quiet, and lethal. I stated that I already knew exactly what the company was worth. The temperature in the private room plummeted. Richard froze his hand, hovering halfway to his mouth. The scotch forgotten. Lauren stopped admiring her diamond bracelet, sensing the sudden severe shift in the atmospheric pressure. Victoria's eyes widened, a brief flash of genuine confusion crossing her polished features. My sentence was not a guess. It was an empirical fact. I knew the value of the fleet. I knew the depreciation rate of the offshore assets. I knew the exact dollar amount Lauren had stolen. And I knew the precise valuation of the 60% stake I was poised to inherit. I possessed the entire ledger inside my mind. The minor skirmishes of the evening evaporated. The psychological warm-up was over. By refusing to play the jealous, defeated outcast, I forced Victoria to abandon her theatrical prelude. Her patience fractured. She realized she could not break me with passive-aggressive toasts or flaunted promotions. If she wanted to excise me from the family tree, she would have to do it directly. The time for veiled insults had expired. The major offensive was about to begin. Victoria reached down beside her chair, her fingers grasping the thick leather portfolio she had carried into the restaurant. Preparing to slide the execution papers into the light, Victoria retrieved the heavy leather portfolio from the floor. She placed it squarely on the table between her champagne flute and Richard's forgotten scotch. The soft ambient jazz playing through the hidden speakers seemed to fade, consumed by the sudden intense gravity shifting inside the room. Victoria lifted her linen napkin, folded it with sharp exact creases, and placed it next to her plate. She leaned forward, bracing her forearms on the edge of the mahogany. Her eyes lost their mocking socialite gleam. They hardened into obsidian flat and devoid of any lingering pretense of maternal warmth. She stated that it was time to dispense with the pleasantries. She did not raise her voice. She did not need volume to project dominance. She spoke with the blunt surgical efficiency of a surgeon amputating a dead limb. "You are adopted, Willow." She dropped the words onto the table like a lead weight. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air between us. She was waiting for the shockwave. She expected the revelation to hit me with devastating force, shattering my foundation and leaving me vulnerable. In her carefully drafted script, this was the pivotal moment. This was the scene where the oblivious daughter learned she was living a lie, triggering a dramatic, tearful collapse. I did not gasp. My heart rate did not spike. I did not drop my gaze or demand an explanation. I maintained absolute unbroken silence. I looked at her, my expression blank, registering the data without offering a single emotional response. In negotiations, silence is a vacuum. The person who rushes to fill it surrenders their leverage. I let the silence stretch for 5, then 10, then 15 seconds. The quiet began to suffocate them. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather squeaking under his weight. Lauren glanced nervously between her mother and me, confused by the lack of theatrics. The dramatic execution Victoria planned was failing to produce the desired effect. The absence of my suffering robbed her of the victory she craved. Frustrated by my impenetrable calm, Victoria pushed her chips to the center of the board. She escalated her attack, abandoning her aristocratic restraint in favor of raw, unvarnished cruelty. She told me I was a charitable act. She said she and Richard brought me into their home out of a sense of obligation. But I was never biologically theirs. She stated that I possessed a cold, rigid nature that clashed with the warmth of the true Rodriguez lineage. According to her assessment, I had never fit in, and my presence was a constant, irritating reminder of a transaction she deeply regretted. She leaned closer, her voice dropping an octave. She hissed that I had always been an ungrateful investment. She confessed they only kept me this long for the benefits, for the financial optics. There it was, the verbal confession of utility. She said the quiet part out loud. The cruelest admission a parent could possibly make to a child delivered with a self-satisfied sneer. She wanted the words to act as a knife slicing through my defenses to expose the bleeding wound beneath. She thought she was finally revealing the dark, devastating truth of my existence. She had no idea she was simply confirming an equation I had already solved 8 months ago in a dusty county records room. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my water glass, took a measured sip, and set it back down. I tasted the word on my tongue. The benefits. I repeated the phrase softly. stripping it of its venom, examining it like a forensic analyst inspecting a piece of physical evidence. Richard finally lifted his head. The color drained from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly pale gray. He looked at me, his eyes wide and panicked, recognizing the dangerous territory his wife had just crossed into. He understood the legal implications of the words she used. Even if she was too arrogant to see the trap, he stammered, attempting to soften the blow, trying to inject a layer of corporate rationale into his wife's brutal honesty. He cleared his throat, his voice weak and trembling. He said the situation was complicated. He muttered about estate planning, tax brackets, and the changing structural needs of the logistics firm. He stated that I was an adult now. He said they had fulfilled their duty and they simply did not need to carry the liability any longer. He spoke of me exactly the way a chief executive officer speaks of a bad loan or a depreciating piece of industrial machinery. He was justifying the write-off. They sat across from me, a united front of profound moral bankruptcy. They were confessing to 27 years of emotional fraud, believing their brutal honesty would break my spirit. They thought the revelation would push me into a state of desperate compliance, making me eager to sign whatever document they placed in front of me just to escape the humiliation. They did not realize they were freely providing the exact verbal evidence I required to justify the execution of Grandfather Harrison's final contingency clause. In the legal architecture of a trust dispute, intent matters. If I challenged their actions in a probate court, a judge would look for proof that the adoptive parents acted with malice, actively conspiring to sever the relationship to circumvent the founder's wishes. A hostile premeditated disinheritance triggers a much swifter legal acceleration than a mutual amicable separation. By declaring that they only kept me for the benefits, by explicitly stating they viewed me as a liability, they wished to discard Victoria and Richard cemented their own guilt. They painted themselves as the exact type of predatory, disloyal heirs Grandfather Harrison anticipated when he built the poison pill. They had spent the entire evening digging their own grave. Now they were handing me the shovel. I looked at Richard, letting the silence stretch again, watching him sweat under his expensive tailored suit. He was a coward, hiding behind the viciousness of his wife while trying to maintain the facade of a reasonable businessman. He lacked the fundamental courage to protect the child he purchased to secure his empire. I nodded slowly, signaling my comprehension. I did not argue. I did not defend my character or list the countless hours of uncredited labor I performed to keep his shipping company compliant. Defending yourself against a narcissist is a waste of energy. It only provides them with the friction they need to validate their attack. I simply accepted their premise. I told Richard the first understood his position. I stated that managing a liability is a difficult task and recognizing when to cut losses is a necessary component of risk management. Victoria's posture relaxed slightly. She mistook my analytical response for submission. She believed the cold, harsh truth had finally crushed my resistance. She thought I was accepting my fate as the discarded asset, ready to comply with their exit strategy. A triumphant gleam returned to her eyes. She reached out and unzipped the heavy leather portfolio resting on the table. The minor skirmishes were finished. The verbal dismantling was complete. It was time to formalize the transaction. She reached inside the dark leather casing, her manicured fingers grasping the thick stack of premium legal-grade paper that would ultimately seal their fate. Victoria withdrew a thick stapled document from the leather portfolio. She did not hand it to me directly. She passed it to Richard, enforcing the optics that he, as the chief executive and head of the household, was executing the final order. Richard took the paperwork. His hands carried a slight tremor. He slid the heavy notarized waiver across the white linen until it rested an inch from my plate. Victoria leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. She delivered her final command with the crisp commanding authority of a judge issuing a verdict. $50,000 to sever all legal ties to the Rodriguez family. Take the money and leave. I looked down at the document. The cover page featured the letterhead of the elite corporate law firm Richard kept on retainer. The title read, Formal Relinquishment and Waiver of Status. I scanned the introductory paragraphs. The language was aggressive, designed to permanently seal every conceivable legal exit. It explicitly released Richard and Victoria from any fiduciary duty, future financial obligation, or legal accountability related to all estates, portfolios, and crucially all trusts known and unknown. It was a beautifully crafted trap. A team of highly paid litigators spent hours constructing the precise terminology to ensure I could never launch a claim against the shipping empire. They built a flawless barricade to protect Lauren's future inheritance. But a flawless barricade is useless if it is built on the wrong coordinates. They constructed their defense, assuming I was ignorant of the underlying architecture. They believed their waiver would cleanly negate Grandfather Harrison's contingency clause. They did not understand that the simple act of presenting this document to me before my 28th birthday was the exact trigger mechanism required to detonate the poison pill. By demanding my signature on a formal severance agreement, they crossed the legal threshold from passive neglect to active hostile disinheritance. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the waiver. I felt the weight of the premium paper. Beside the document, Victoria had placed a cheap branded plastic pen from the restaurant's reception desk. She expected me to pick it up, scribble my surrender, and walk out of the Vanguard broken and destitute. I ignored the plastic pen. I reached down into my leather tote bag. My hand bypassed the plain manila folder containing the unredacted trust charter and the embezzlement files. I let my fingers close around the cold, solid metal resting at the very bottom. I withdrew Grandfather Harrison's heavy silver monogrammed fountain pen and placed it deliberately on top of the severance waiver. The silver caught the ambient candle light gleaming with an undeniable vintage authority. The engraved initials HR faced directly toward the center of the table. Victoria's eyes darted to the metal. The smug, victorious expression vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a flash of deep, visceral disgust. She recognized the pen immediately. She had spent the weeks following Harrison's funeral, tearing the Greenville estate apart, searching for it. Furious that the old man's prized possession was missing from his mahogany desk. She considered it a vital piece of the family legacy, an heirloom meant to be displayed in a glass case reserved exclusively for the true bloodline. Her jaw tightened. The muscles in her neck pulled taut. She demanded to know where I acquired the pen, her voice sharp and laced with sudden paranoia. I did not flinch. I picked up the heavy instrument, feeling its substantial weight balance perfectly in my grip. I traced the intricate silver engraving with my thumb. I told her grandfather left it to me. I kept my tone conversational as if we were discussing the weather rather than exposing a decade-old theft. I explained that he gave it to me during our final meeting in his study. I recited his exact instructions, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. He told me to keep it hidden. He told me to only use it when I was signing something that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my life. Victoria's face flushed with a dark, ugly red. The realization that the old man had bypassed her, bypassed Richard, and bypassed her beloved Lauren to gift a significant heirloom to the acquired charity case infuriated her. It was a posthumous insult she could not tolerate. Her carefully constructed narrative of total control was cracking. Lauren leaned forward, sensing her mother's rising anger. She wanted the transaction finished. She wanted the $50,000 deployed so she could secure her phantom promotion and continue funding her casino debts without the annoying presence of a risk actuary looming in the background. She rolled her eyes, exhaling a loud, dramatic sigh. She told me to stop being theatrical. She ordered me to just sign the paper so they could finish their dinner in peace. I ignored Lauren. Her opinion held zero mathematical value in the current equation. I directed my focus entirely on Richard. He was the linchpin. He was the biological son, the named heir in the original charter and the primary signatory on the severance waiver. If I was going to trigger the acceleration clause and strip him of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, I needed his explicit, unambiguous confirmation on the record. I had to offer him the rope and let him tie the knot himself. I looked at my adoptive father. I offered him one final opportunity to display a shred of human decency. I gave him the chance to pull the document back, to apologize, to recognize the trap his wife had built, and walk away before the jaws snapped shut. I asked him a direct, clarifying question. I pitched my voice low, ensuring the gravity of the inquiry penetrated his cowardice. You want me legally excised from the family tree before my 28th birthday? It was not a request for an explanation. It was a demand for confirmation. I laid out the specific timeline, highlighting the impending deadline. I needed him to acknowledge the exact parameters of the action he was taking. Richard stared at the silver fountain pen resting in my hand. He looked at the engraved initials of his dead father. A flicker of genuine hesitation crossed his eyes. He possessed enough business acumen to recognize when a negotiation felt slightly off balance. The sudden appearance of the heirloom. My unnatural calm. The precision of my phrasing. The variables were aligning in a pattern he did not understand. And it unsettled him. He opened his mouth, perhaps to suggest delaying the signature to review the paperwork one more time. But Victoria shot him a terrifying, venomous glare. She demanded his compliance without saying a word. She required him to execute the order and finalize the purge. Richard's spine collapsed just as it had every single day for the past 27 years. He surrendered his authority to the cruelest person in the room. He averted his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. Yes, he whispered. The syllable barely registered above the hum of the jazz music. But the legal and financial implications echoed like a gunshot. He confirmed the hostile severance. He explicitly verified the timeline. He activated the trigger mechanism his father had buried deep within the corporate archives. The minor skirmishes were over. The psychological maneuvers were exhausted. The confirmation was secured. The evidence was gathered. And the timeline was flawless. The moment for passive observation had officially expired. It was time to close the ledger. I uncapped the silver fountain pen. The click of the metal cap removing itself from the barrel sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the dining room. I did not lower the nib toward the signature line of their corporate waiver. Instead, I reached back into my leather tote bag, my fingers brushing past the cheap plastic restaurant pen, and grasped the edge of the plain, unmarked manila folder. Waiting in the dark, I held the uncapped silver fountain pen in my right hand. The polished metal felt cool and solid against my skin, a tactile reminder of the legacy I was about to enforce. Victoria, Richard, and Lauren watched the NIB, anticipating the moment I would finally press the ink against the thick premium paper of their severance waiver. They were holding their collective breath, waiting for the signature that would legally erase my existence and permanently secure their wealth. I did not sign their waiver. Instead, my left hand emerged from the leather tote bag holding the plain, unmarked manila folder. I lifted it above the table and dropped it squarely on top of their corporate document. The folder landed with a flat, definitive smack. It covered the signature line, completely obscuring the predatory legal clauses Victoria's attorneys had spent hours drafting. The sound shattered the tense silence of the private dining room. The jazz music humming from the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly felt entirely inadequate for the gravity of the moment. Victoria blinked, her eyes darting from the manila folder to my face. The smug certainty that had defined her posture all evening began to fracture. She demanded to know what I was doing. Her voice sharp. but laced with a sudden, unmistakable current of hesitation. I looked directly at her, letting my gaze hold the same sterile assessing quality I used when examining a bankrupt risk portfolio. I told her I did not need her $50,000 severance. I kept my tone perfectly even, devoid of any theatrical inflection. I stated that she had built a flawless trap, but she had filed the wrong paperwork. The room fell dead silent. The atmospheric pressure inside the Vanguard plunged. Richard stopped breathing. Lauren lowered her wine glass, the crystal hovering inches above the tablecloth, her arrogant smirk replaced by genuine confusion. They had spent 27 years underestimating my intellect, treating me as an underperforming asset, incapable of independent strategy. They were suddenly facing a variable they had never modeled. I reached forward and flipped open the cover of the manila folder. I laid the first document flat on the table, smoothing the heavy parchment with my palm. I pointed the silver nib of Grandfather Harrison's fountain pen at the deep red wax seal pressed into the bottom corner. I announced that the document resting before them was the original unredacted foundational charter for the Harrison Irrevocable Contingency Trust. Richard's face turned the color of damp ash. The blood drained from his cheek so rapidly he appeared physically ill. He recognized the seal. He recognized the specific legal formatting his father's estate attorneys utilized. He possessed enough corporate awareness to understand that an unredacted trust document appearing on a dining table meant a structural breach had occurred. I did not pause to allow him to recover. I drove the blade deeper. Citing the exact metrics of their ruin, I directed their attention to Clause 4, Section B. I read the text aloud, ensuring the heavy, unyielding legal parameters echoed off the mahogany walls. The clause stipulated that if the adoptive child was legally severed, disinherited, or pressured to relinquish her status prior to her 28th birthday, a severe financial penalty would automatically activate. I looked at Richard, letting the words sink into his cowardice. I told him the penalty demanded that he forfeit 60% of the Class A voting shares of Harrison Logistics. Victoria let out a short, harsh breath. The arithmetic began to process in her mind. 60% was not a minor reprimand. It was not a slap on the wrist or a temporary reduction in dividends. 60% meant the immediate loss of majority control. It meant surrendering the empire. I tapped the paper with the silver pen, drawing their eyes back to the text. I delivered the final component of the contingency. I explained that the forfeited shares did not return to the primary estate. They did not dissolve into a blind trust or transfer to a secondary holding company. According to the architecture, Grandfather Harrison designed the voting shares vested immediately and irrevocably directly to me. Victoria lunged forward. Her manicured fingers clawed at the heavy parchment, dragging the document closer to her face. She scanned the dense paragraphs, her eyes wide and frantic, searching for a loophole, a typographical error, any indication that the trap was an illusion. Her hands shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors, rattling the table and causing the water glasses to vibrate. She slammed the papers down. She shrieked that the document was a forgery. Her voice cracked, soaring into a shrill, hysterical pitch that violated the sophisticated atmosphere of the restaurant. She accused me of fabricating the charter, claiming her attorneys had vetted the estate and found no such contingency. I met her hysteria with cold empirical fact. I told her the document was authenticated by the Delaware Probate Court. I explained that I retained independent counsel to unseal the addendum attached to my original adoption decree. I laid out the timeline detailing how I acquired the certified copy the moment her corporate lawyers finalized the estate audit. I leaned closer, ensuring my next sentence dismantled her final shred of hope. I stated that the contingency clause was designed to remain dormant until my 28th birthday. If they had simply waited 3 weeks, the trap would have expired. but by forcing the severance tonight by explicitly demanding my signature on a hostile disinheritance waiver before the deadline. They had triggered the acceleration clause. I looked from Victoria to Richard. I told them the wait was over. I get the 60% right now. Richard groaned a pathetic hollow sound of total defeat. He buried his face in his hands, his elbows resting heavily on the white linen. He understood the lethal precision of the maneuver. By trying to save $50,000 and secure the legacy for Lauren, they had just handed me the controlling stake of a regional shipping monopoly. He was no longer the chief executive officer. He was a minority shareholder at the mercy of the daughter he had treated like a stray. But the audit was not finished. The structural dismantling of the Rodriguez estate required one final phase. I needed to prove that their pristine biological bloodline was toxic. I reached back into the manila folder and extracted a second stack of papers. These were not printed on premium parchment. They were standard stark white printouts filled with dense numerical grids, offshore routing numbers, and digital authorization logs. I slid the second document forward, placing it directly in front of Lauren. The golden child stared at the top page. Her eyes locked onto the Cayman Island vendor names. I announced that the secondary file was a comprehensive forensic audit. I explained that it detailed 3 years of fraudulent ghost invoices, unauthorized departmental budget increases, and offshore wire transfers. I kept my gaze fixed on Lauren, watching the arrogant superiority drain from her features, replaced by stark, paralyzing terror. I stated that the audit proved Lauren had actively embezzled over $400,000 from the logistics firm to cover illicit online gambling debts. Lauren let out a choked, ragged gasp. Her fingers went numb. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped from her grasp, tumbling onto the table. The fragile stem shattered upon impact. The vintage Bordeaux spilled across the pristine white linen, spreading rapidly, a dark spreading stain that resembled fresh blood. Victoria stared at the shattered glass, then at the audit papers, and finally at her biological daughter. The matriarch who built her entire identity on the superiority of her genetics was suddenly confronted with undeniable proof that her trueborn heir was a common thief. The pristine legacy she fought so ruthlessly to protect was built on a foundation of theft and addiction. The arithmetic of their ruin was absolute. I held the controlling shares of the empire, the legal authority to terminate Richard, and the criminal evidence required to send Lauren to federal prison. The silent acquired asset had executed a flawless hostile takeover between the appetizers and the main course. I capped the silver fountain pen, the sharp click echoing in the devastated silence of the room. The trap had sprung, the jaws locking tight around their arrogance. I possessed everything required to walk away victorious. But a corporate takeover is merely a transfer of assets. It lacks the profound poetic justice necessary to truly close the ledger. I had one final variable to introduce to the equation. A human element that would shatter Victoria's delusion of superiority far more effectively than any financial ruin ever could. I needed her to meet the woman she thought she had erased 27 years ago. I pushed my chair back from the edge of the mahogany table. The wooden legs glided silently across the thick dining room carpet. I stood up. The simple physical movement altered the geography of the room, elevating my sightlines and shifting the focal point of the negotiation. For 27 years, I remained seated while Victoria dictated the terms of my existence. I was done sitting. I looked down at the matriarch. The spilled vintage Bordeaux continued to soak into the white linen near her right hand, a dark stain mirroring the sudden collapse of her pristine legacy. "You said I was an acquired asset," I stated, keeping my voice steady and measured. "You said I was adopted, a charity case and a financial burden." "I know. I have known the exact mechanics of your transaction for 8 months." Victoria stared at me. Her throat worked trying to swallow, but she could not formulate a response. The air in the private vault felt thin, depleted of oxygen by the crushing weight of the corporate coup I had just executed. I told her the unredacted trust charter and the embezzlement files were only the preliminary findings. I explained that an actuary does not present a final audit without verifying every single variable. I said that was why I asked a secondary party to join us tonight. Right on cue. The brass latch of the heavy oak door clicked open. Nobody at the table moved. Richard remained slumped over his empty scotch glass. Lauren sat frozen, her eyes wide, terrified that federal investigators were stepping through the threshold to arrest her for the ghost invoices. Victoria gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, bracing for the next blow. The waiter did not enter. Elena did. She stepped into the dim velvet-lined dining room with the effortless grace of a chief executive accustomed to commanding difficult spaces. She did not wear the muted, subservient colors Victoria preferred her dependents to adopt. Elena wore a stunning emerald green blazer tailored to exacting standards layered over a crisp black silk blouse. The deep green fabric caught the ambient candlelight, projecting a vibrant, undeniable authority. She looked radiant. She looked successful. She stood in the doorway scanning the opulent toxic wealth radiating from the table and remained entirely unfazed. She built her own empire from raw dough and blistering ovens. The manufactured intimidation tactics of a country club dining room held zero power over a woman who had survived the predatory extraction of her own child. Victoria turned around in her leather chair. I watched the exact moment recognition struck the matriarch. It was a fascinating, devastating psychological fracture. 27 years ago, Victoria sat in a sterile agency office and looked across a desk at a terrified, impoverished 17-year-old girl. Victoria handed over a staggering check, purchased the newborn required to secure her husband's trust fund, and erased the teenage mother from her mind. She categorized Elena as a tragic disposable vessel. Now that disposable vessel was standing 15 feet away. Victoria's eyes widened in horror. Her jaw slackened. The polished aristocratic mask she wore every single day cracked down the center, exposing the fragile, panicked narcissist hiding underneath. Her brain struggled to reconcile the conflicting data. The woman standing by the door was not broken. She did not look desperate for cash or hungry for an apology. She radiated an equal, if not superior, level of wealth and sophistication. "Hello, Victoria," Elena said. Her voice carried a warm, steady resonance. It lacked any trace of the hysteria or bitterness Victoria might have expected from a fractured victim. It was the calm, resonant tone of a creditor arriving to collect a long overdue debt. Elena took a deliberate step into the room. She kept her posture relaxed. Her gaze locked directly onto the woman who had funded her exploitation. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Elena added. The sentence echoed off the wood paneled walls. It was a flawless reclamation of the narrative. Elena bypassed the head of the table. She walked right past Richard, who remained paralyzed in his chair. She walked past Lauren, ignoring the shivering, disgraced thief entirely. Elena walked the length of the mahogany table and stopped directly at my side. She did not stand behind me or hover at a polite distance. She closed the physical gap Victoria had engineered. She reached out and slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were warm and firm. The simple, profound gesture of physical contact provided a stark contrast to the cold, calculated isolation I endured within the Rodriguez estate. I held her hand, feeling the steady pulse of a mother who had saved a seat for me when no one else would. Victoria was paralyzed. The breath hitched in her chest. She looked at our linked hands, then up at Elena's composed features. The empirical loss of the shipping monopoly was a severe financial blow, but the scene unfolding in front of her delivered a fatal psychological wound. Victoria built her entire identity upon a foundation of perceived superiority. She justified her cruelty by convincing herself that her genetic lineage was pristine while my origins were inherently defective. She needed me to be a failure to prove that her biological daughter was a success. She needed my biological mother to be a tragic low-class cautionary tale to prove that she was the benevolent, sophisticated savior. That delusion was currently disintegrating. The biological daughter Victoria worshipped was a gambling addict facing federal embezzlement charges. The acquired charity case Victoria despised was the brilliant risk actuary who just legally outmaneuvered her entire corporate legal team. And the impoverished teenager Victoria, erased from history, was standing before her as a self-made titan, radiating a quiet, invincible dignity. The hierarchy was inverted. The narrative was dead. You. Victoria stammered. The single syllable broke through her trembling lips. She lost her aristocratic composure. Her hands shook as she gestured vaguely toward Elena. What is she doing here? The question was laced with raw panic. Victoria was no longer managing a controlled termination. She was trapped in an orbit she could not escape, facing the physical embodiment of her own cruelty. I tightened my grip on Elena's hand. I looked down at Victoria delivering the final verdict with the clinical precision of a judge sealing a permanent record. She is here to watch me audit your life. Victoria, I said. The emotional devastation on the matriarch's face was profound. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sallow, chalky gray. Her shoulders collapsed inward. The diamond ring on her finger lost its luster, suddenly appearing heavy and absurd. She had not just lost the 60% controlling stake in Harrison Logistics. She had not just lost the phantom promotion she planned to bestow upon her criminal daughter. She had lost the one thing a narcissist values above all else. She lost the story she told herself. She could no longer play the victim of an ungrateful dependent. She could no longer play the savior of a discarded orphan. The paperwork resting on the table proved she was a predatory heir attempting to steal an empire. The shattered wine glass proved her chosen successor was a fraud. And the woman standing beside me proved that true wealth and dignity are built through resilience, not purchased through exploitation. The silence returned to the private dining room. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet Victoria utilized to assert her dominance at the beginning of the evening. It was the definitive hollow silence of a ruined dynasty. The ledger was fully exposed. The debts were calculated. There was nothing left for them to say. And there was no legal maneuver they could execute to reverse the damage. But closing the accounts required one last administrative action. I needed to issue the final terms of their surrender and walk out of the vault they built for me. I released a slow, steady breath, preparing to deliver the closing statements, and leave the Rodriguez family sitting in the wreckage of their own arrogance. Victoria lost the structural integrity required to hold herself upright. She collapsed back into her tufted leather chair. A guttural sound escaped her throat. It was a raw, unedited noise stripped of her usual aristocratic polish. It sounded like the air escaping a punctured tire. She stared down at the spilled vintage Bordeaux bleeding into the pristine white linen. The dark stain mapped the exact parameters of her ruin. She spent 27 years curating an illusion of effortless superiority. She treated human beings as disposable assets, discarding anyone who failed to inflate her social capital. Now the disposable asset had orchestrated a hostile takeover, and the impoverished teenager she exploited stood beside me as an invincible self-made titan. The narrative Victoria worshipped was dead. Richard did not attempt to comfort his wife. He did not reach across the table or offer a strategy for damage control. He simply folded. He leaned his elbows on the edge of the mahogany table and buried his face in his palms. His shoulders slouched, stripping away the confident posture of a chief executive officer. He knew the arithmetic. He understood the lethal efficiency of the contingency clause his father built. He recognized that his tenure at Harrison Logistics was finished. He was a coward who traded his moral compass for a corner office. And now both were gone. Lauren sat frozen on the opposite side of the spilled wine. She looked at the printed audit pages resting near her plate. The Cayman Island routing numbers and the casino debt markers stared back at her. The arrogant smirk she wore at the beginning of the dinner was a distant memory. A cold, paralyzing panic gripped her features. She realized the phantom promotion to Chief Operating Officer was a ghost. She was not inheriting a shipping empire. She was facing a multi-count felony embezzlement charge. I looked at the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their own arrogance. I felt no lingering anger. I felt no sorrow. I experienced the deep, quiet satisfaction of an auditor closing a fraudulent ledger. I reached forward and picked up my plain manila folder. I placed the unredacted trust charter and the criminal audit back inside the cardboard flaps. I retrieved Grandfather Harrison's silver fountain pen, secured the cap, and dropped it into my leather tote bag. I left their notarized severance waiver resting on the table. It was a useless piece of premium paper, a monument to their failed trap. I slung my tote bag over my shoulder. I looked down at Victoria, who was still staring blankly at the stained tablecloth. I delivered my final assessment with a quiet, level tone. Keep the $50. 000. Victoria, I said. You are going to need it to pay Lauren's legal fees. I turned away from the table. Elena kept her hand in mine. We walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. We did not rush. We moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of two women who held all the leverage. I reached out, turned the brass latch, and opened the door. We stepped through the threshold and walked out of the Vanguard together. The crisp autumn air outside the restaurant felt clean and sharp. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the Rodriguez family dissolved the moment we hit the sidewalk. I looked at Elena. She smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that reached her eyes. She told me she was proud of me. For the first time in my life, I accepted a compliment without scanning it for a hidden transactional motive. The execution of the corporate trap required 3 days. On Monday morning, Elias Sterling walked into the Delaware probate court. He filed the formal acceleration clause, submitting the signed affidavit confirming the hostile severance attempt. The court recognized the trigger mechanism embedded in Grandfather Harrison's charter. The legal machinery moved with ruthless efficiency. By Wednesday afternoon, the state authorized the irrevocable transfer of 60% of the Class A voting shares to my name. I did not celebrate. I went to work. I convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors at the Harrison Logistics headquarters. Richard sat at the far end of the long glass table, his face drawn and exhausted. I placed the certified share transfer documents on the projector. I informed the board that a change in primary ownership had occurred. As the new majority shareholder, I initiated an immediate vote of no confidence regarding the chief executive officer. The board reviewed the data. They recognized the shifting tide and voted to protect their own interests. Richard was formally ousted from his position before the lunch hour arrived. He packed a single cardboard box with his golf putter and his expensive Scotch glasses. 2 security guards escorted him out of the building. Dealing with Lauren required a more specialized form of corporate justice. I called her into this boardroom after the directors dispersed. She walked in, trembling her designer clothes, looking suddenly too large for her shrinking posture. I placed the encrypted embezzlement files on the desk between us. I offered her a choice. I told her I could forward the Cayman Island routing numbers to the federal authorities, guaranteeing a lengthy prison sentence for corporate fraud. Alternatively, she could sign a strict non-negotiable repayment contract. She chose the contract. I stripped her of her senior vice president title. I revoked her access to the luxury corporate condominium and seized her company-funded sports car. I subjected her to a grueling entry-level data processing job in the windowless basement of the compliance department. She was forced to sit under flickering fluorescent lights auditing the very supply chain logs she used to ignore. Every cent of her meager new salary was automatically garnished to repay the $400,000 she stole. I forced the golden child to perform the exact uncredited, soul-crushing labor she once mocked me for doing. The threat of federal prosecution hung over her head. Ensuring perfect attendance and absolute submission, I spent 2 weeks restructuring the internal protocols of the shipping firm. Once the ledgers were clean and the fraudulent offshore accounts were sealed, I made my final move. I am a risk actuary. I calculate value and I recognize when to liquidate an asset. I possessed zero desire to spend the rest of my career running a logistics empire built by a family I despised. I contacted a ruthless private equity firm headquartered in New York. They specialize in acquiring distressed maritime assets. They reviewed the newly stabilized margins and offered a staggering buyout for my 60% controlling stake. I signed the sale agreement using Grandfather Harrison's silver fountain pen. The transaction severed my final tie to the Rodriguez name. I walked away with a fortune large enough to ensure I would never have to calculate the cost of my own existence ever again. I erased their numbers from my phone. I never spoke to Victoria, Richard, or Lauren after the corporate sale closed. They faded into the background, a bad investment I successfully wrote off my personal ledger. My weekends no longer consist of performing uncredited labor in the shadows. Elena and I have dinner every Sunday evening. We do not meet in velvet-lined private dining rooms. We eat in the warm, loud kitchen of her flagship bakery, surrounded by the smell of toasted yeast and the hum of industrial ovens. We talk about the future, our business ventures, and the simple, quiet details of our daily lives. When I walk into her kitchen, I never have to search for my designated chair at the far edge of the room. I never have to justify my presence or earn my portion of the meal. Elena always pulls out the stool directly next to her own. I never have to calculate my worth at her table because my seat is always waiting. If your family treats you like a line item, do not shrink yourself to fit their budget. Do not beg for a return on an investment they never intended to honor. Do not cry when they present you with the bill. Audit the ledgers. Find your true worth. And when they finally reveal their hand, close their accounts for good. We all keep silent ledgers in our minds. We track the debts we owe, the favors we extend, and the grievances we endure. In the complex architecture of the American family, these ledgers are often buried beneath the surface of holiday photographs, manicured lawns, and the polished veneer of success. We are taught to revere the traditional family structure as a sanctuary, a safe harbor from the ruthless transactions of the corporate world. But what happens when the sanctuary is run like a boardroom? What happens when a parent looks at a child and sees a line item instead of a human being? The story of the Rodriguez estate is not merely a tale of a hostile corporate takeover. It is a fundamental examination of family responsibility and the devastating consequences of conditional love. Victoria and Richard built an empire of logistics, moving freight across oceans and balancing multi-million-dollar accounts. Yet, they failed the most basic fundamental duty required of a parent. They failed to provide emotional safety. In a culture that frequently equates financial prosperity with moral virtue, it is easy to confuse provision with parenting. Richard believed providing a roof and a prestigious surname fulfilled his paternal obligations. He hid behind his executive title, using his wealth as a shield to avoid the difficult, messy work of emotional engagement. He allowed his wife to turn their dining room into a battlefield because stepping in would require him to face his own cowardice. A father's role is to protect his children not just from the elements, but from the internal rot of favoritism and cruelty. By choosing his own domestic comfort over my dignity, he forfeited his right to be called a parent long before I ever handed him that severance waiver. Victoria represented a different kind of failure. She viewed motherhood as a competitive sport, a method of acquiring social capital among the country club elite. She believed that love was a finite resource, one that must be earned, quantified, and ultimately restricted. She handed me an itemized bill for my high school existence because she wanted to ensure I knew my exact price tag. She needed me to feel small so her biological daughter could appear towering. But raising a child requires honesty, fairness, and a deep, unyielding emotional awareness. When a parent introduces a transactional dynamic into a home, they do not just damage the child. They marginalize. They destroy the child they favor. Look at Lauren. She was the golden child, the biological heir, the recipient of the luxury sedan and the effortless praise. Victoria shielded her from every consequence, elevating her to a pedestal built on unearned privilege. In doing so, she stripped Lauren of the opportunity to develop resilience, integrity, or a basic moral compass. By removing the boundaries, Victoria did not create a successor. She created a thief. Lauren's descent into gambling addiction and corporate embezzlement was the direct inevitable result of a mother who valued optics over character. When we refuse to hold our children accountable, we are not loving them. We are abandoning them to their own worst impulses. True family responsibility requires the courage to look at a child, acknowledge their flaws, and guide them toward a standard of fairness. It requires sitting at a table and distributing the portions equally, not based on genetics or utility, but based on the inherent value of the person occupying the chair. Grandfather Harrison understood this. He was a man of the old world, a founder who knew the sting of hard labor. He saw the toxic environment Victoria was constructing, and he recognized the danger of leaving a legacy to an entitled generation. He could not undo the adoption, and he could not force his son to be a brave man. But he provided the tools for survival. He taught me to read the fine print. He offered me the quiet, steady guidance a child needs to navigate a hostile world. He understood that a parent's ultimate responsibility is to ensure their child can stand on their own 2 feet when the shelter collapses. And then there is Elena. Elena did not possess a sprawling estate in Greenville. She did not have a fleet of corporate attorneys or a seat at the elite charity galas. She baked bread. She worked in a kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, building a life from scratch after enduring the trauma of a predatory extraction. When I walked through the glass doors of her bakery, she did not calculate my worth. She did not ask for a resume or an apology. She simply pulled out the stool next to her own. That is the essence of parenthood. It is the simple, profound act of making space. It is the willingness to look at a child and say, "I saved a seat for you, and you do not have to pay rent to occupy it." Elena provided the emotional anchor that Victoria spent 27 years withholding. She proved that a true family is not defined by the documents filed in a county courthouse or the blood running through your veins. A family is defined by the people who stand beside you when the ledger is empty. We all navigate the complex dynamics of our own origins. Some of us are born into homes with deep roots and unconditional warmth. Others are born into boardrooms, forced to calculate our value every single day just to justify our presence in the house. We learn to read the room to anticipate the shifting moods, to shrink ourselves to avoid the friction. We become risk actuaries in our own living rooms. But you do not have to remain at a table where your plate is treated as a burden. If you are currently sitting on the edge of a family dynamic that demands your labor but denies your dignity, recognize the transaction for what it is. Do not spend your life auditioning for a role they never intend to cast you in. You cannot force a narcissist to see your humanity. And you cannot teach courage to a coward. The only variable you control is your own exit strategy. We share these narratives to remind you that your worth is not dictated by the people who failed to see it. If this story resonated with the quiet battles you fight in your own life, you are not alone. Follow Revenge Order for more stories about setting boundaries, closing toxic accounts, and finding the courage to walk away from a rigged game. Drop a comment and tell us about the moment you realized you had to build your own table. As you move forward, examine the ledgers you keep in your own heart. Think about the people you invite into your home, the expectations you place on the children you raise, and the boundaries you draw around your own peace. We spend so much time worrying about the legacy we leave behind in bank accounts and real estate. But the true legacy is the emotional blueprint we hand to the next generation. Take a moment tonight and look at your own dinner table. Look at the chairs you have arranged. Who is sitting at the center? And who is being pushed to the edge? The distance between those seats might seem trivial now. But 20 years from today, that empty space will become the exact distance a child walks to leave you behind forever.